After 4 decades of presiding over a courtroom, you learn to read a person the moment the heavy wooden doors swing open. I have seen every variation of the human condition: the terrified, the remorseful, the broken, and the defiant. But there is a specific kind of arrogance that belongs exclusively to the young, a shield of perceived invincibility, forged by privilege and a profound lack of life experience. I usually recognize it instantly: the smirk, the slouch, the rolled eyes. Before I tell you about the boy who walked into my courtroom on a crisp Tuesday morning, let me explain how I view my role. I was not placed on this bench merely to swing a gavel and collect fines. My courtroom is a place of accountability. I was raised by parents who taught me that your character is defined not by what you get away with, but by how you own your mistakes. When a young person stands before me, I don't just see a case file, I see a crossroads. The justice system is often the last stop before a reckless path becomes a ruined life. I take that responsibility personally. That morning, the docket was heavy with routine matters. Then, case number 4 was called Liam Foster, 19 years old, citations for reckless driving, severe property damage, and public endangerment. Liam strolled, he didn't walk. He strolled up to the podium. He wore a designer jacket that likely cost more than the damages he had caused, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. He chewed a piece of gum with a slow, deliberate rhythm, looking around the room as if he were waiting in line at a coffee shop rather than facing a judge. Beside him stood his mother, a woman who looked as though she hadn't slept in a week. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her handbag, her eyes fixed firmly on the floor. I adjusted my glasses, looked down at the file, and then locked eyes with the young man. "Mr. Foster," I began, my voice steady, designed to cut through the thick noise of his entitlement. "Remove your hands from your pockets and spit the gum out into the wastebasket. You are in a court of law, not a playground." He let out a short, breathy laugh, a scoff really, and slowly complied, making an exaggerated show of walking over to the trash can. When he returned to the podium, the smirk remained plastered on his face. He looked at me with a gaze that radiated pure disrespect. He thought I was a fool. He thought this entire proceeding was a game, a minor inconvenience in his otherwise consequence-free world. He believed his youth and his family's clear affluence would serve as a shield, just as they probably always had. He had no idea that power ends where my courtroom begins. The charges were severe, but reading them from a sterile page hardly captured the reality. According to the police report, Liam had been driving his imported sports car at double the speed limit through a quiet neighborhood. He lost control, jumping a curb and smashing through the front porch of a small home. The property damage was extensive, but that wasn't what made my stomach turn. It was whose porch he had destroyed, and how he reacted. Sitting in the gallery was Arthur Pendleton, an 82-year-old retired teacher and veteran. He sat with his hands resting on a wooden cane. The night of the accident, Mr. Pendleton had been sitting on that very porch. The violent impact threw him from his chair, resulting in a severely fractured collarbone. When police arrived, they didn't find Liam checking on the bleeding elderly man. Bodycam footage showed Liam standing by his crumpled bumper, complaining loudly into his phone about his custom paint job. When an officer asked him to step back for paramedics, Liam scoffed, muttering that the old guy shouldn't have been sitting so close to the street anyway. I read this aloud, letting the ugly truth hang in the heavy air. I looked at Mr. Pendleton, who nodded with quiet dignity. Then, I looked at Liam. I expected a flicker of shame. Even the most hardened individuals usually show remorse when their worst moments are broadcast publicly. Not Liam. He shifted his weight, checked his pristine fingernails, and let out a loud, exaggerated sigh, clearly bored by the trauma he had inflicted. "Do you find this tedious, Mr. Foster?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous register. "Is recounting how you nearly killed a man cutting into your schedule?" He looked up, entirely unfazed. "It was an accident, Your Honor. My dad's insurance already paid for the porch. I don't see why we are making a huge deal out of this." His mother squeezed her eyes shut, a tear tracing down her pale cheek. She knew he had just crossed a line. He had reduced a man's suffering to a simple financial transaction. He believed his privilege could buy his way out of basic human decency. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the bench, and fixed him with a stare that has leveled men twice his age. "Mr. Foster, the fact that you view this as nothing more than a financial transaction is precisely why we are making a huge deal out of this. You did not just break wood and glass. You shattered an elderly man's sense of security in his own home. You fractured his body because you couldn't be bothered to respect a speed limit. I paused, letting the silence amplify my words. Your father's money might repair the porch, but it does not repair your character. And right now, your character is severely lacking. Liam rolled his eyes again, crossing his arms over his chest. Look, Your Honor, with all due respect, I have places to be. Can we just get the fine over with? My dad said. I don't care what your father said, I interrupted, my voice sharp and commanding, echoing off the high ceiling of the courtroom. Your father is not the judge here. I am. The courtroom fell dead silent. Even the bailiff stood a little straighter. The smirk on Liam's face finally faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine surprise. He wasn't used to being spoken to this way. He wasn't used to his father's name failing to act as a magical password that opened all doors and solved all problems. His mother, standing beside him, finally spoke up. Her voice was thin, choked with emotion, but it carried across the quiet room. Your Honor, please. I turned my attention to her. Mrs. Foster, I understand you are here to support your son, but supporting him doesn't mean shielding him from the consequences of his actions. She looked up at me, tears streaming freely now. It's not that, Your Honor. I'm not trying to shield him. She took a deep, shuddering breath. I'm terrified for him. The shift in the room was palpable. Liam looked at his mother, confusion warring with annoyance on his features. Mom, stop it. Don't do this here. But she didn't stop. She turned fully toward me, her hands gripping the edge of the podium so tightly her knuckles were white. He thinks he's invincible, she said, her voice cracking. He thinks because his father works hard to provide for us, that the rules don't apply to him, but he doesn't know. He doesn't know what his father has been hiding. The mother paused, fighting to keep her composure. She looked at her son, then back at me. His father is a very successful man, Your Honor. He works in corporate finance. He manages millions. But what Liam doesn't know is that his father isn't invincible either. Liam shifted uncomfortably, his previous arrogance replaced by a tense confusion. Mom, what are you talking about? She ignored him, her voice gaining a desperate strength. My husband, Liam's father. He was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's 6 months ago. He's losing his motor skills. He's struggling to walk. We've hidden it to protect Liam, to let him enjoy his youth. She turned to face her son, her tears now flowing freely. You think your father's money protects you, Liam? You think he can just buy your way out of everything? He can't even button his own shirt some mornings. He is terrified of losing his independence. And you almost took that away from an innocent man. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. The revelation hung in the air, thick and heavy. Liam stood frozen. The color drained from his face. The reality of his mother's words, the sudden collapse of the invincible image he held of his father, struck him with a visible physical force. He looked at his mother, then slowly turned his gaze toward Mr. Pendleton. For the first time since he entered the courtroom, Liam really looked at the elderly man. He saw the cane. He saw the fragile frame. He saw the reality of vulnerability, a vulnerability that, until a minute ago, he believed only applied to other people, not to him or his powerful family. The smirk was completely gone. In its place was a look of dawning horror. The invincible shield of his privilege had just shattered, exposing him to the harsh reality of human frailty. I let the silence stretch for a long moment, allowing the weight of the truth to settle firmly on his shoulders. Mr. Foster, I said, my voice softer now, but no less firm. Do you still find this proceeding tedious? He swallowed hard, his eyes dropping to the floor. No, Your Honor, he whispered, his voice stripped of all its previous bravado. Good, I replied, because your education is just beginning. The courtroom remained in a suspended state of shock. You could see the precise moment the architecture of Liam Foster's worldview collapsed. The protective walls built of trust funds, expensive cars, and his father's untouchable reputation crumbled into dust right there on the courtroom floor. He stood at the podium, no longer an arrogant teenager playing a part, but a frightened boy, staring at a reality he was completely unprepared to navigate. I turned my gaze toward Mr. Pendleton. The elderly man sat quietly in the gallery, his hands still resting on the polished wood of his cane. He had listened to the mother's desperate confession with a profound stillness. There was no vindication in his eyes, no malicious joy in seeing the boy humbled. Instead, there was only a deep, weary understanding. It is a terrible thing to witness the breaking of a spirit, even one that desperately needed to be broken. Mr. Foster, I said, my voice breaking the heavy silence, Look at the man sitting in the front row. Really look at him. Liam slowly turned his head. He didn't want to look. The shame was finally catching up to him, flushing his cheeks and making his shoulders slump. But he forced himself to meet Arthur Pendleton's eyes. That man, I continued, survived a war. He survived decades of teaching children, building a life, and earning the right to sit peacefully on his own front porch. And in a matter of seconds, your carelessness stole his safety and fractured his body. You looked at him bleeding on the ground and complained about the paint on your bumper. You did that because you believed that vulnerability was a weakness that only applied to people who couldn't afford to buy their way out of it. I paused, letting the words sink into the quiet room. But as your mother just bravely shared, vulnerability comes for us all. It does not care about your zip code. It does not care about your bank account. It does not care how fast your car can go. It comes for the elderly man on the porch, and it comes for the powerful executive in the corner office. Liam's hands gripped the edge of the podium. His knuckles, previously relaxed, were now white with tension. He was breathing heavily, his eyes darting between his weeping mother and the elderly man he had harmed. The illusion was gone. The money couldn't fix his father, and the money couldn't erase the absolute ugliness of his own behavior on the night of the accident. You thought you were above the law, I told him softly, making sure he heard every single syllable. But no one is above the fragility of the human condition, and until you understand that, you are nothing more than a danger to yourself and everyone around you. The tension in the room was excruciating. I could see the battle happening within Liam, the conflict between the arrogant persona he had constructed and the sudden, devastating weight of the truth. His mother's tearful plea had done what no lecture, no fine, and no threat of jail time could have accomplished. It had pierced his armor. I waited until I was certain the lesson had fully taken hold before I spoke again. The fine for your actions stands, I said, my voice echoing clearly. But a fine is merely a financial transaction, and as we have established, you do not value money. You value your time. You value your comfort. Liam looked at me, a flicker of apprehension returning to his eyes. He didn't know what was coming, but he knew he wasn't going to like it. Therefore, I continued, in addition to the fine and the suspension of your driver's license, I am ordering you to complete 200 hours of community service, and you will not be serving those hours picking up trash on the side of a highway. I gestured toward Mr. Pendleton. You will serve those 200 hours at the Sunnyvale Veterans Rehabilitation Center. You will push wheelchairs. You will assist with physical therapy exercises. You will sit and listen to the stories of men and women who have sacrificed more than you can currently comprehend. You will witness their struggles, their pain, and their resilience. I leaned forward again, locking eyes with him one final time. You will learn what real vulnerability looks like, Mr. Foster. And you will learn what it means to be a man of character when the protective bubble of power finally pops. Liam slowly nodded. It wasn't the defiant nod of a teenager forced to agree with an adult. It was the slow, weighted nod of someone who had just experienced a profound paradigm shift. I understand, Your Honor, he said quietly. Court is adjourned, I announced, bringing the gavel down with a sharp crack. As the courtroom cleared, I watched Liam and his mother leave. He didn't stride out with his hands in his pockets. He walked slowly, his arm wrapped supportively around his mother's shoulders. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. It was the first sign of genuine humility I had seen from him all morning. Sometimes, justice isn't about punishment. It's about dismantling the illusions of power and replacing them with a much-needed dose of reality. And on that Tuesday morning, a young man who thought he was untouchable finally learned how fragile we all truly are. Months passed. The seasons changed, the harsh winter melting into a hopeful spring, and the daily rhythm of the courtroom continued its relentless march. I saw hundreds of faces, handed down hundreds of rulings, but the memory of Liam Foster and his mother stayed with me. You always wonder, when you hand down a sentence aimed at rehabilitation rather than mere punishment, if it will actually take root. You wonder if, once the initial shock wears off, the entitlement will simply grow back, thicker and more stubborn than before. 6 months after that Tuesday morning, my clerk, Christina, walked into my chambers and placed a manila folder on my heavy oak desk. It was the compliance report from the Sunnyvale Veterans Rehabilitation Center. Usually, these are standard, soulless forms, boxes checked, hours tallied, a single administrative signature at the bottom, but this file was unusually thick. Attached to the official paperwork was a 2-page handwritten letter from the facility's director, a retired Marine named Thomas Vance. I adjusted my glasses, leaned back in my leather chair, and began to read. Thomas wrote that for the first 2 weeks, Liam was exactly what you would expect from a privileged teenager forced into labor, sullen, silent, and deeply uncomfortable. He did the bare minimum, avoiding eye contact with the patients, retreating into himself whenever the physical realities of the rehabilitation floor became too graphic, too loud, or too real. He treated the center like a prison sentence he just needed to survive. Then, Thomas decided to change the boy's assignment. He moved Liam to the dining ward, specifically tasking him with assisting patients who had lost their fine motor skills and could no longer feed themselves. "Judge," Thomas wrote in his neat, disciplined script, "I didn't know the boy's family history at the time. I didn't know about his father. I just knew this kid needed to learn patience. I assigned him to assist a veteran named Harrison, a man whose hands shake so violently from a neurological condition that he can no longer hold a spoon." The letter detailed how Liam had completely frozen on his first day with Harrison. Watching the proud, older man struggle with his trembling hands, the boy had suddenly broken down, dropping the tray and rushing out of the room. Thomas found him a few minutes later in the hallway, leaning against the cold tile wall, sobbing uncontrollably. The terrifying reality of his own father's Parkinson's disease, the loss of control, the vulnerability his family was so desperately trying to hide, had suddenly materialized right in front of him in the form of a stranger. I stopped reading for a moment, letting out a slow breath. Sometimes the universe delivers exactly the lesson we need, in the exact moment we are finally stripped bare enough to receive it. When Liam finally composed himself in that hallway, he didn't ask to go home. He didn't ask for a different, easier assignment. He walked back into the dining room, wiped his face, pulled up a chair next to Harrison, and gently picked up the spoon. According to the director, that was the day the arrogant teenager disappeared. In his place, a young man of substance began to take shape. Liam completed his mandatory 200 hours by early spring, but the report indicated he hadn't stopped coming. He had transitioned into a permanent volunteer. He spent his weekends pushing wheelchairs, cutting up food, and listening to the quiet, unglamorous dignity of men who had lost their physical strength but retained their honor. He was finally learning what real power looked like. The transformation in Liam Foster wasn't something that happened overnight, and it certainly wasn't broadcast for the world to see. It happened in the quiet, sterile rooms of the rehabilitation center, away from his wealthy friends and the protective bubble his father had built. But the impact of that change rippled outward. I know this because, exactly 1 year after his court date, I received another envelope. It wasn't an official compliance report this time. The return address simply read, Liam Foster. Inside was a handwritten note on plain white paper. The handwriting was careful, a stark contrast to the sloppy signature he had scrawled on his court documents a year prior. Judge Judy, the letter began. You probably see a lot of people like me, kids who think they own the world until someone forces them to realize they don't. I wanted to write this because I needed you to know that you were right. My father's money couldn't fix what I broke, and it couldn't protect me from the reality of life. He went on to explain that his father's condition had worsened, but that spending time with Harrison and the other veterans had prepared him for it. He wrote that he had learned how to feed his father, how to help him dress, and more importantly, how to sit with him in silence when the frustration became too much for the older man to bear. I thought power meant never having to say you're sorry, Liam wrote near the end. I thought it meant doing whatever you wanted. But I learned at Sunnyvale that real power is having the strength to carry someone else when they can no longer carry themselves. Thank you for not letting me walk out of your courtroom the same person I walked in. I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the top drawer of my desk. In my 40 years on the bench, I have seen power used as a weapon, a shield, and a tool of manipulation. I have watched people throw their names, their wealth, and their connections around like currency, expecting the scales of justice to tip in their favor. And sometimes, unfortunately, outside these walls they do. But inside a courtroom, true justice demands that we strip away those illusions. It demands that we look past the designer suits and the arrogant smirks to see the character or lack thereof underneath. Because when power fails, when the privilege collapses and the reality of human vulnerability sets in, character is the only thing that remains. And sometimes, all it takes to build that character is a moment of absolute, uncomfortable truth, and the decision to hold someone accountable, not because you hate them, but because you believe they can be better.